Well, thank you. My name is Abraham, and she's Marisol. And in the context of my exhibition here in Galerie Chantal Crousel, we will talk about different things that we share with Marisol. We just met recently. We both are from Mexico, but we met here in Paris. And even, I would say we didn't meet in Paris, but we met online because we were invited to participate in a talk about an artwork by a collective of artists called Bikini Wax. And then, so I thought, when thinking in this series of conversations, along with the exhibition here, La Señora de las Nueces, to have good talks, with conversations with people that we can share or have some crossing points to talk about. And then after some little arrangements, we understood that we could talk about portability. In some of the works that are in this exhibition, one of the material is their portability. I mean, these are like sculptures that are to be taken to the street after being made with materials from the street and using as sort of a protocol limitations, boundaries, and restrictions. In the time we are experiencing now, like with lots of protocols of after the virus and its consequences, we have to adjust our time and our movement, our geography, our psychogeography in this, according to these restrictions. So I decided to make this my material. Then the sculptures that are in the exhibition are made mostly with this material, that is restrictions. And then with found objects from the street, and then with giving them some experience in the street by taking them to the places that I have some sort of affection to, like my favorite bar or one of my favorite restaurants, the house of my dearest friends, my beloved park, and so on. Then they came back to the gallery and they were finished here using materials found in the street again, and they are now hanging here as pending or hanging sculptures that maybe are still changing. They are now, I would say, they are carrying themselves in the space of the exhibition. And so this kind of portability or light weight of its nature, it is, I mean, like a very important aspect of them. And then as I understood that Marisol's, one of the most important fields of knowledge of Marisol is comic books or BD, bande dessinée in France, historietas in Mexico. She went to study in London a degree, a post-degree for doing this, as in Mexico there was not really interest in supporting this research. She came to London and then she stayed in France, and she's been doing more research, and now she's a curator and works in a gallery here. And then GB Agency is the name of the gallery. So I thought it could be something important to discuss, like the idea of our habits for reading, that we used to read like at home, of course, or in the school, or in libraries, but also walking in the street. Like here in Paris, since I remember, people went reading on the subway, like standing on the subway reading, or walking reading, like holding a child and taking the, etc. So this kind of portability is been changing a lot because of portable devices, electronic devices, I mean. So now we can watch a movie on a screen, in a portable cell phone, on the subway, and while walking, or we can write even, like chatting. We can participate in multiple conversations simultaneously in a portable device. So we kind of been shifting our portability, I would say like habits, but also I would say like prosthetics, because normally the prosthesis, the prosthetic was the book. or a radio maybe, then it was like the CD player, like a Walkman, and then like a different MP3 devices, and now it's definitely the cell phones. So from that, I think it could be something interesting to talk about like this, like the economics and the politics and the cultural context of this shift. In my understanding, like here, I think still in France there is lots of tradition in terms of BD, like people, children, but also adults, they read like graphic novels while walking in the street, but at the same time, they share their time with chats and video phone calls. Also, that was, in my perception, more like sci-fi when I was a child, and now it's possible that we can walk from here to there and making a video phone call with your beloved person in Irapuato or in Michoacán or in Beirut with your cell phone in the street. So, thank you, Marisol. Yeah.
Thank you. And yeah, I would say there's like a historical, talking about portability, there's a historical fear of portability. And thinking about the mecapale and, you know, the mecapale, this stripe you wear to carry heavy stuff, this is something that working classes or even slaves used to use. So this notion of something that you actually have to take with you is something that it's a class issue as well. And it goes for comics as well, and it goes for books, and comics that became books as well. Because now, for instance, I mean, I'm going to do like a leap in time when I go to this kind of book, a comic book that was like the super working class thing that used to fit on your pocket.
Right.
And because it fit on your pocket, this was supposed to be trash. It's obviously trash if it's made to fit on your pocket. If it's meant to come with you in the street and get dirty and, you know, have the traces of time in it, this is it's not class. You know, it's not classy. Mm-hmm. So I would link it to that. Essentially, the portability is it's a notion that has very recently become widespread. Mm-hmm. Even in your document with images, like right at the end, we see how the mecapale becomes like this thing of sports and it becomes integrated into the leisure class, and so you can buy it without guilt. No, it's just this this incredible invention of Indians that we can all use. But at the beginning, I mean, who would wear this? Only a slave could, like in the Western colonialist mentality. You know? So it feeds back to all these kinds of things, and it feeds back as well, I think, to initial fears against things like Kindle or electronic books, like book publishers used to say until very recently, like, oh no, like you shouldn't buy those because they're going to kill books, and this is terrible because like the sacrosanctity of the book should be respected, and a book should be, you should have the book, and as if the thing in itself was more important than the act of reading, no?
Like a fetish, maybe.
Like a fetish. And in a way also it goes to, we're seeing it now with what you were saying of watching series and watching films, and the pandemic has triggered this massive transition to streaming. But I mean, you see even, I don't know, Martin Scorsese saying, watch my film that I did for Netflix, but watch it on the movies, on the cinema. And it's like, what cinema am I going to watch it on? Like there's no cinema that plays your film anyway. So there's this ambivalence to, like the fetish of the thing that it has its own place in, like, but it's very loaded with class notions, I think.
Yeah, I think what you say, it applies very, very strongly in Mexico, of course. But what you say, the mecapal, the thumb line is in English, the band that goes to the forehead to carry a heavy weight on your back. It's also used in different places, like in Asia, like for carrying tea bags or rice. And but we know it better maybe because of the Mexican use for carrying goods in the market and so. And in my case, it's good that you remind me of this, because an important part of this project is also one of the references from pre-Columbian culture, the Olmec culture, that is the sculpture of El Señor de las Limas, that is a statue of a sacred sculpture made in stone that was carried, supposedly, was meant to be carried to wherever it was needed, like a portable shrine. And then maybe this portability was transferred in colonial times to power and maybe exploitation of people, Indians or slaves like black people, by the colonizers. And then how it went into contemporary life, into something else that we like. We don't. I never went to Patagonia to buy this thing to carry my things in the Himalaya, you know. Yes. But people do. So it kind of, there is a different shift there also. That I think it's also very good what you talk about, this portability again in terms, accordingly. I mean, as an analogy to Kindle, like that thumb line in the sports store, maybe in Fifth Avenue in New York, or here in any boulevard, would be like that, like the equivalent of contemporary Mecapal, no? The Kindle of literature. And this is not like that, no? Like this, what you know more about the comic books in Mexico are like very much kind of the old Mecapal, no? Like for the slave, or not the slave, but the lowest of the economic classes in society in Mexico, no?
Totally. So yeah, I was thinking from seeing the video you made with Patricia Fallier, and there was something she said about an anthropologist that started doing ethnological research and had to learn to do started to learn to do the things. So there was this experience of redoing, and from that redoing comes knowledge. So I was thinking, going back to this notion of wearing it, like carrying them around. I mean, one thing is to do the sculptures, but then what do you learn from carrying them around? Like having the experience of the object, walking, like how does it change? How did that change you?
I mean,
your notion about the object?
I think it's a good question, because it changed my perception of my own body. I mean, I don't have like an attraction to my own representation, let's say, but like I always feel my own body in reality. I mean, my weight, let's say, my boundaries, my physical boundaries, but I don't like to see myself. Here I used a couple of mirrors for making some drawings, prints, and I was kind of horrified at looking at myself doing something. And then again, when doing this kind of activity, carrying the sculptures in the street, and I went with Gabriel Moraes, a younger artist from Brazil, who accompanied me to document all this promenade. And I was kind of, again, horrified of looking at myself suffering, carrying these things in the street, like in a almost ridiculous way, but not because of feeling myself like ridicule, but like or ridiculized, but more like understanding that I was kind of learning through some sort of not really understanding my own body, you know, like having to learn how to bend my back so to carry properly and not hurting my spine, my backbone, as if I walk like vertical, it should be bad for my health. Then I went to remember slowly again and again that I should bend my body like this. Then it was like a strange consciousness of the self, like not necessarily a narcissistic one, but very much the opposite.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You're bending for the object.
Exactly, completely. Which means also very symbolically, I would say, it's like bending your body in front of a shrine or in front of the authority, in front of the higher upper class person.
Yeah.
You know, like saying, well, we say in Mexico, mande as an answer.
Yeah, yeah.
When they call your name, they say mande.
Yeah.
Like it's tell me what to do, no?
Exactly. Like I'm at your service.
Yeah. So it's funny that what you were saying, that all this literature that is like they call them like junk literature is meant to be for these people who are like answering Monday.
Yeah.
No?
Yeah. I mean, even if you see the how do you say encuestas?
Polls, maybe?
Yeah, the polls, like the National Poll of Reading. There's two that they make in Mexico, one about reading and one about culture, like this. And they pose questions to people about what do they read. And like the questions themselves are so bad. Like they're meant to diminish anything that is not books. But you know, Mexico is a country in which a book is a luxury. So very few people can actually first afford a book. And then there are very few bookshops, like there are less and less bookshops. So it's really, the questions about books are ridiculous. So, but it's all designed, so once you get to the questions that are about magazines and then comic books come really at the bottom. So once you get there, people is truly ashamed of not having read anything that is before that. No, so you don't read books, you don't read even magazines, you don't read journals, you don't read newspapers. Do you read comics? And people must be depressed by then, and they're like, no, like, of course not, of course I don't read comics. But these are, or used to be, the things that sell the most, but now they're almost, what were the Mexican comic books are really non-existent now. But proof that Mexico was and is a country of comic book readers is that you go to any newsstand today and it's filled with comics, it's filled with manga and all this DC and Marvel and graphic novels. You have Watchmen, even expensive, like Watchmen is not an expensive comic and it's serialized and people buy it. So it was just, it was this class prejudice that killed this industry. And it was this prejudice about these things being for poor people that killed this industry. So these artists that used to make these things and were actually capable of doing great things are still out there, most likely unemployed, while the American industry is thriving, selling the American comics in Mexico, even though they're quite big and they're they completely disregard all of the notions that Mexicans were so worried about in their own comics, including this fake portability prejudice that working men, working people could only read this trash because it was tiny and it fit in their pockets. No, they could also read other things, but they were boxed to be fed these things.
You know, I think I told you that I studied, properly speaking, education. I mean, pedagogy in the university. And when I was about to write my thesis, it was a long time ago. I wanted to write my document about like a comic book, Memín Pingüín. It was a very strange portrait of Mexican society, in which the main character is an African descendant boy, and all the characters are their friends in the school, and he's the only one that is a caricature. All the rest are like a kind of naturalist representations of people. And there was like a bad representation of the kid. And then I wanted to study, I mean, like in a kind of a transdisciplinary approach from sociology, ethnography, and so to talk about this, how they discuss the education space in that context in a comic book that I used to buy every week in the corner of my house, in the kiosk. But this is because myself, I was fruit of that education, the school, the public school, and reading comic books. And this is also something that I remember, like everywhere I went, like in my grandmother's hometown in the west of Mexico, in Michoacan, in Nahuatl, her hometown, there were always like piles, like we have now, of comic books in her house, but also in the toilet. That was not even a toilet, it was a latrine. And in the latrine there were always like this exactly the same that we used to wipe our asses. So the paper had two uses, like for reading and for cleaning your crack. And then...
So this was in the 70s?
I was, yeah, I'm old.
No, because we're really talking about, we're making stress on this particular pile, because this particular pile, these are all from the 80s. So these are really like...
These are jewels.
These are poverty exploitation comics. So this was like the reason, essentially, why everything went downhill after this, essentially. Like, people were like, no, this is awful. Like, for instance, I don't know if you can see this one. This one is called, I like the title of this one. This is how I am, so what? And in the back you have a deformed Mexico, and you have all this, and it's tagged, it's full of graffiti, like the form of Mexico. So you have always this sexy tragedy, because you need sex and violence. So you have sex and violence, sex in the schools, but never you have explicit sex. But so it's always flirting with
it's
it.
Again about the representation, because there is lots of hypersexualized bodies, mostly female bodies, that are like I mean also male bodies, but in a soft porn narrative also, along with the graphic, or I'd say like visual representation of bodies, that I think for some, I mean, at least let's say 3 generations, we grew up with this education, like looking at bodies that of course didn't match with our reality at all, and always this, I mean, like almost genital situations, but that never happened in a very popular context, like cab drivers, homemaids, like house workers, I mean, or factory workers, or countryside people. It was like a flirt in the conflict and in the clash with the higher upper class blonde white guy, and like a white, and like, what's the name, like a Cinderella thing, or I don't know what was. No, it was like the other one. Was the servant and the prince or something, well, whatever.
But did you finish your anecdote about the latrine?
Oh yeah, so that good. Thank you for reminding me that when we went to, when I went to visit my grandmother in Nahuatl, in her hometown, we went sitting, because it was a bench with 2 holes, a wooden bench back in the orchard, and it was a little shack. And the latrine was there, and we were sitting along with my brother or my sister, because you could share the moment. And we were reading along different booklets, these comic books. And then when you finish, of course, you use as I said, you use the pages that you already read, and then you end up with a print in your back with the images from the comic book. So it became also portable.
No, but what I wanted to say about it is that there's, relating to comics, there has been research also about chromophobia, and how this fear, there's actually part of the fear about these comics is that the colors are like so flashy, like you shouldn't, this is obviously the color itself going to drive you mad, there's something wrong about this kind of color. And there is this, it goes back again to this class prejudice about portability. There's also a class prejudice about color. So white is okay, black and white is okay, but color, no, color is no good. And this has been applied to different things, but comics, there's new stories, for instance, about when comics became widespread at the end of the 19th century, there was a movement in the US against colored comics, because like people were alarmed that the lower classes were consuming things with colors, because they were like they're going to awaken their erotic impulses,
right.
you know, like you have to keep them at bay, and part of the ways in which people used to do this or tried to do this was in limiting color. So it was part of what was so scandalous about them, that they were like.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know. I think for me this is important also because I started working as an artist, making these things. I mean, I was a caricature artist since I was a child, because I grew up reading this, and then I started making as a teenager drawings for magazines and for newspapers, as a cartoon artist, like political cartoons mostly, but also comic strips for a newspaper called La Jornada. I worked some years as a comic strip artist. And I mean, it's a very important part of my identity and my education. And I'm super glad that you brought this, Los Agachados, that is an independent publisher who had this artist. His name is Rius, Eduardo del Rio, who, not so curiously, was also from Michoacán. Mm-hmm. And he produced, in a very hard time in Mexico, during a sort of repressive and oppressive state against any kind of opposition, political opposition, he was the only one raising his hand and his voice to go against the government and publishing these kind of pamphlets in the way of the comic strip with very specific characters that are the lumpen, those who doesn't know that are oppressed, you know, in terms of the theory. I don't know, like this is Nopalzin, mm-hmm. that was never wearing shoes, for instance, you know, and it's of course dark skin, and there is always the policeman who's the repressor, and so on. He had also, this is Los Agachados. He made also Los Supermachos.
We have it in the book.
Yeah.
The book.
The book.
Yeah.
Los Supermachos. Well, Rius was my hero. I grew up with Rius as my grandmaster Flash, seriously. And then after him, there came a newer generation of artists, cartoon and political cartoon and comic strip artists that who educated me in making this and publishing, like El Fisgón, Magoo, and mostly them, but also Naranjo, Helio Flores, and then younger generation like Elguera and so on. So me and other friends, like my dearest friend Damián Ortega, we started as comic artists, and so I was very happy to find that Marisol is who knows more about this, you know, and I don't know, maybe we have also Calimán, which is like not political at all, but it's also part of my education.
Right. I only have this one of Calimán. Calimán was interesting because it was like a completely Mexican hero, but he wasn't Mexican. He was like Egyptian or something, no?
He was a blue-eyed, pale Egyptian something.
But it's like the most successful hero, like, made in Mexico. Right. Because it was actually before a comic, it was a radio novel, no?
Calimán.
El hombre increíble. So then they became this incredibly successful comic, but I mean, if you see it from this one, it's actually quite rich, the kind of drawings. But this already comes from a big tradition that starts with this kind of comics, with this kind of formats. So this is hardbound. There's about
a collection, no?
Yeah, this is a collection of 9. So one of them is about this many, and inside it you had many stories. So this came daily, and it was printed in the millions every day. So this was from the 30s to the 50s, there was this incredibly profitable and creatively rich industry that created all the stories. And we were seeing this with Abraham. We were wondering why they were printed in this kind of color, but I think this was black when it was first printed. But anyway, it was one ink because it was just cheaper, yeah. The paper, it wasn't meant to be kept. It was people would buy it and then they would exchange it. Everyone in the family would read it and then they would rent it. And when they could get all the money they could from a single issue, maybe they either fall apart or they would resell it. So this is the way some of them survive, and this is really a rarity. You have here like a photo novel mixed with...
it's a collage drawing mixture.
Collage drawing. For instance, the creator of the comic that I researched the most, which was El Libro Vaquero, he started doing the decors. So there was someone that drew only the backgrounds, and there was someone else that did only the characters, and there was someone else that did only the photographs. There was this incredibly big industry of people like specializing in this kind of thing. I lost sight of. Oh yeah, I want to show you this one. This is Gabriel Vargas, one of the few figures that was actually redeemed from this whole industry, mostly by Carlos Monsiváis. Mm-hmm. And but now by the work of El Fisgón, that is I think he's the chief curator of the Museo del Estanquillo, which is this incredible museum that has a collection of popular cultural objects from a cultural critic who died a few years ago, 10 years ago, Carlos Monsiváis. So this guy, Gabriel Vargas, created many stories, the most famous of which is La Familia Burrón, who was this comic that looked a bit like this, but was about people living in vecindades, which I don't know how you would translate.
Like a little alley with lots of families together.
Yeah, like a closed alley with a bunch of families and bunch of kids, and they were all working class. So it was like, but also they were working class, but a lot of them were people that used to live in the countryside and just very recently moved into the city. So there was obviously this...
Immigrants.
Immigrants. And there was this décalage between the traditions and the way of living in the countryside and the big city and anonymity and all the madness that it brought with it and the debauchery that it brought with it. So, and he he portrayed it in hilarious. It was hilarious, and he was this incredibly witty guy that, I mean, he represents a true comic artist, right? Yeah. Like, is able not only to do incredibly original and good drawings, but also just really witty and wonderful with language, and it just, you can read them now and they're incredible.
I think this one, especially La Familia Burrón, that one that you were talking about by Gabriel Vargas, that is not exactly this, but it's the same author. This, he provided a great critical portrait of Mexican society after the 50s. I mean, from the 60s maybe to the 80s, but like the lowest of the classes of Mexico, at least in Mexico City, with this contrast of immigration and so. But like the construction of each character is so beautiful and precise. And I remember one of the poorest in the alley, in this corridor of houses, is a guy who lives with his mother, and he's an older guy, like maybe in his 40s, and he's doing nothing, and he earns no money, and his mother is the guardian of the alley, and he's a poet.
Of course.
He's like the only thing he doesn't do, like a stereotype, is smoking marijuana, but almost. And his name was Avelino Pilongano. And all were like humiliating him because he seems to be a lazy person, but he's an artist, he's a poet. And the meanest of those is Borola, the wife of the main character also, Don Regino Burrón. And Borola makes coffee after boiling butts of cigarettes she collects in the street. So this is, and she's the powerful one. she's the richest, let's say,
yeah.
because she has initiative. Everything else, everybody else is deep down.
Everywhere.
Right. That also was super influential in my earlier iconography or my construction of reality, I would say. And I think this also mean, like, now that Calimán's, this one you have there has this representation in the cover. I think there is something else that we don't have here, that is Lágrimas y Risas, that is a photo book, no, not photo, but a comic strip also, but about like an African-American person or African descendant in Mexico, living in Veracruz. Rarotonga.
But Rarotonga, it's, this is why I have this one, because this is definitely a representation of a kind of Rarotonga.
Yeah.
No?
It's Rarotongish.
Rarotongish representation. So Rarotonga was a special case because so rewind. There was this comic that looked like this one, but like this, like this kind of paper and printing stuff. And it was written by a woman that was an incredibly successful writer and author of comic books, Yolanda Vargas Dulce.
Right.
So she had this, it was called Lágrimas, Risas y Amor. And she created this mythology about this trip that she made. This is very important. She made a cruise travel with her husband to this tropical island somewhere in Pacific Islands. And they saw this woman, this incredible black woman, and they were so impressed that they had to write the story about her. And thus, the birth of Rarotonga. But when you see the dates, they just don't match. They just wanted this exotic, black, indigenous woman. I think it's more like an indigenous woman, but because they couldn't create in their imagination a sexy indigenous woman. Like this is my thesis. Like they couldn't allow themselves to imagine that this could be Mexican. So it's actually not in Mexico, and there's also this ambiguity.
Island.
It's in an island. It never says where it is. It's just this island because she couldn't be Mexican.
Right.
You know, like she's and so the character, to tell you a bit about the story, it's this super powerful, wealthy, sexually liberated woman, super sexy, that looks like this when she dances in her crazy rituals. But then when she's stressed, she's super elegant and just fabulous, and this really attractive woman. But she's not Mexican. And because she has all these qualities, she doesn't live in society either. She's like the master of a bunch of illiterate Indians. This is in the story. So it's just this crazy thing that she can be powerful, she can be wealthy, sexy, and all of that, but just not in the city, you know, like just not in Mexico.
Not for the metropolis.
Not for them. And when she goes to the metropolis, she's treated badly. She encounters racism. They think she's poor.
Right.
So it's actually terrible. But it was incredibly popular. So, and it originally came in the 50s, I think in the early 50s. Then it even became radio novel, and then it was printed and reprinted for decades until like the version I have is a reprint from the early 2000s. So you see that I talked to my mom even about it, and she was like, my dad was crazy about Rarotonga, like it was this super sexy fantasy of someone that could be Mexican, but they just wouldn't dare to make her Mexican.
Yeah, I think I was confusing with Chanoc that happens in Veracruz.
Yes.
That is a completely different story, no? Like is the male body sexualized there? It's the opposite, no?
Yeah.
There's a kind of a playboy in a very low budget context.
Yeah.
Like
no, but I mean, you're right to like make this link because this is what they were playing with as well. Like, this could be Mexican, but we can't say it. Like, because the kind of stories, now that we see this trash, for instance, it's useful to understand also that the counter side of this trash were very conservative comics. We also had comics in which you had priests that were about religion, that were just for very conservative people. And these that also happened through the lens of comics.
Right.
So Yolanda Vargas Dulce particularly, I think this was her great success, that she appealed to the people that wanted to read comics, but they thought some of these stories were too romantic or too explicitly, not explicit, but like explicitly leading to something else, to something sensual, and they just wanted to remain castos, you know, like. But there was this whole
but
spectrum.
still exotic and you know, like a kitschified representation. Of
They wanted to stay infantilized. Yeah.
Didn't they produce a soap opera on TV about like Rarotonga?
I don't think about Rarotonga, but
El Pecado de Oyuki, they did.
Yes.
That's
yes.
another comic.
That
from
was another comic.
Yolanda Vargas Dulce. No?
Exactly. They made several telenovelas from her comics. And actually, telenovelas are a byproduct of comics, essentially. Like when you see this, think that when this happened, there was no television, literally, when this kind of comics came out. This is the 40s. And television, I think it started in Mexico in 56. And so when television came, the first stories, like romantic stories that were translated to television were this kind of things. Like, I mean, it's made for this.
Right.
Almost, they just translated it to moving image, but telenovelas are a byproduct of this. So they were very naturally in dialogue, let's say.
It's interesting the how they wanted to make something like following some sort of mirroring in other exotic references, because Mexico by itself, it's been always kind of an exoticized thing, even recently or yet now with Coco and all these films and so. But then there, like thinking, for instance, that comic about like a Japanese lady, you know, like a Japanese El Pecado de Oyuki, and they made the comic book and then the soap opera, the telenovela, and so on. It's like kind of a strange game of shifting exoticism, no?
Yeah, it's funny that they just couldn't exoticize themselves. No?
Maybe.
Like they had to look away.
Yeah, never themselves or ourselves, let's say.
Or like obviously ourselves. They had to hide.
You know, I was thinking in this Chanoc, the other one that happens in Veracruz, because it's this guy who's a super handsome person, always doing a canoe, and with his godfather, who's an old guy, always horny, chasing ladies. And it happens near there in Veracruz, where in fact El Señor de las Limas was found in that east part of Mexico. And I remember like the way they had a couple of characters representing kind of cavemen, I mean, and they used to play soccer, football, like kicking a coconut, like in there, like a not exoticizing something, but producing an extreme caricature of Mexicans as a primitive, or I don't know, like a very, very, I would say, like a rude in a way, you know. And then I think it happens everywhere, different ways. I don't know, like in different contexts, like El Payo, another one that's a kind of a how do you say it, like a mariachi? What is that?
Yeah,
like
I think he was a mariachi.
A mariachi, or I don't know, like a cowboy, Mexican cowboy.
Ranchero.
A ranchero, ranger, I don't know, like but also in a very strange representation of the scenarios and so that I think are everywhere, no?
This goes back to the story of how like comics first got into Mexico is that they were pushed by the newspapers to fight against the liberal caricatures that were made against Porfirio Diaz. So this was like the end of the last years of the 19th century, and El Fisgón has made this huge research about this kind of comics about this kind of caricature, and the first comic strip that was imported in Mexico was precisely to fight against the
political aspect of
political that were so successful. But then what happened is that in the 20s, El Universal, this national newspaper, called for a contest to create national comics. And like there was this wave of new comics that were all inspired by like life, right? Like just regular life. So all the comics you have here, they're not about superheroes, or they're rarely about they rarely have supernatural aspects, but you have La Familia Burrón that is about this alley, these people working and
like
struggling, just regular people going about life and suffering. And there was also this regular calls in all this kind of magazines for people to write their stories and send them, and they were turned into comic books. So there was this feedback loop to life.
Right. Yeah, I think, I mean, like, this historical aspect that you are mentioning takes me to think about, like, how it evolved in time, like Mexico in particular, this language or this discourse that it always remained belonging to lower classes or to working class people, as differently to other countries. I mean, now that you mentioned El Fisgón, who was one of my gurus or one of my mentors when I started making my own comic strips, and I admire him yet now. And he went to research and to study history, and he has like a post-degree in history because of learning more about this. But how this changed from the time of the dictatorship in late 19th century to now, and how it's been always a political, challenging aspect of Mexican society, the cartoon, the political cartoon, and the caricature, I mean, and the role of the caricaturist in society. But as different to other countries, because I believe like you have the political caricature in Mexico and this comic, like a libro vaquero would be the emblem. Like two different things in a spectrum of a society that is completely unequal and unfair economically and culturally also. I would say the access to education, for instance, and so produces a big gap. And like in France, for instance, the production of BD, bande dessinée, and graphic novel, like in the US, it's kind of part of high culture, you know, like in a way that it's like you have Jodorowsky making comics with Moebius, or you have like all this tradition of contemporary books for children yet, like John Sfar, who makes children books, but he's a professor in the Beaux-Arts de Paris. And there are many different aspects that it's not something like kept low, even because, or you have Charlie Hebdo on the other hand, like very political and even critical, different ways in crisis, but criticizing power and still producing some controversial facts, I would say, that are now even more delicate than ever. But this doesn't happen in Mexico. Or maybe the last thing that I remember that happened in Mexico is that they kidnapped Rius to make a simulacrum of killing him.
Yeah.
And they didn't, but it was maybe some other disappeared and were tortured and murdered in Mexico that we don't know. But still it's something completely different, no?
I think part of what happened is that the protectionist Mexican state was very successful in the 60s, 70s, even like till the 80s. I mean, you tell me. But for me, seeing it from history is as if everything that happened in Mexico and in Europe, in the US and in Europe, in terms of comics with an X, right? Like Robert Crumb and everything around him. It's essentially counterculture was an afterthought, was an after fact in Mexico. So it eventually arrived somehow, but it was it didn't at all have the power or just the amount of people participating in it. So it fed back into the industry. It just never fed back into the industry. So the industry became stalled and repetitive and formulaic and just uninteresting, and eventually died. So, and also, it didn't speak anymore to the people. It stopped speaking to the people because as an artist, maybe you didn't get the memo of what happened everywhere else, but everywhere else was advancing somewhere else, and Mexican comics were not. So I think it's part of it. And if you see, for me, you as an artist and like your generation is precisely this, you were feeling this gap because you need it. And you tell me, correct me if I'm wrong, but you didn't find, you found El Fisgón, but El Fisgón, this was even countercultural in itself. No, this was marginal. It's not that in school or like very naturally you encountered his comics in a bookshop, or this was this guy that was against the current, doing his own thing, and now he's become mainstream somehow, mainstream like in an academic way, but his comics, I wouldn't call him mainstream even now.
No.
So yeah, it's just there was this big gap in information, and that's why I think we never, like this industry never made the leap from low culture to what you have in France, for instance, that comics are actually made into books, and yeah, like they have a different status, different symbolic status, and people don't think they're trash. People that, like the government makes the year of the BD and things like that. Although I would introduce some nuance there to say that BD artists are very underpaid and they live very precarious lives, even in France. Maybe not in the US as much, but definitely in France, they're always struggling. So symbolically, this is high art, but at the level of production, like material production, these guys are no better than any other working people. So, yeah.
Well, yeah, I think it's very important what you said, because it's when we talk about the industry of BD, of the industry of comics at that time with X in the US, and this one, the historietas in Mexico, like Libro Vaquero, it was like a big group of persons doing different things for a final product that are still, maybe those who still work in that are not well paid, and they are like part of a chain of exploitation as well. So there is no real possibility for transforming or to evolve into anything else. But I think still is good to, I mean, in my case, because I again, this is part of my education, I still see this influence in my work as an artist, and effectively we went looking for something else as a generation, maybe, not organized, not in an organized way, but looking for something that would not promise anything in that context. Even when I have to acknowledge that through El Fisgón, through that artist, I went to know, I mean, when we met in a workshop he gave as the beginning of La Jornada newspaper, and he called it like a graphic humor workshop. And we attended like 4 kids, and we thought that he could teach us how to make drawings, but instead he gave us to read Kropotkin, Malatesta, Proudhon, all the anarchist authors. So that's what we learned. And then he showed us like a Dada artist, like the German expressionist making collage, and Daumier, Goya. And then I went to learn that there was a universe beyond this comic thing. And then even when I think still humor is very present in my work, and maybe a political consciousness in a way, maybe, I kept that soul or that spirit that had no future if I dedicated my life and my energy to do comics, as maybe the Hernandez brothers in California did with Love and Rockets, for instance, or I don't know, like other authors of comics in the US or here, like again, many other authors that you find and my children read now, for instance, no?
Do your children read Love and Rockets?
No, I don't have at home, but I will try to get some, yeah.
That's a good
We read Magus, you know, the historical comic, but no, we have to find more. I mean, we are trying to focus in the local BD, and then we are doing different things, but nothing so political yet. Yeah.
I was shocked to see, this is very anecdotal, but I follow Gilbert Hernandez in Instagram, and I was shocked to see once that he was putting out some art, not from Love and Rockets, but some drawings he was making, and they were like $100, but he sounded like he really needed the money, and I was like, how come? Like, it's a symbol of how terrible the industry is. Like, how does someone of the caliber of Gilbert Hernandez finds himself, you know, like putting it out there, like, I need the money, I need $100.
And there must be a secondary market of that. Like, I
yeah.
found like many of Daniel Johnston's drawings also around like for 150, and so that is not properly comic art or comic book art, but it's still like something that sub-products of, you know.
But it goes back to saying that even though we recognize these guys are incredible artists, not only drawings, they're just so versatile in their art, but they're not valued, and I say valued like in money, they're not valued
market value.
They're not valued as artists, so they remain just workers that happen to draw and write and do that really well.
And I was thinking also in a different aspect that it's maybe not related to that, but like how like it could be now at this moment in 21st century, like for these kind of publications, not only in Mexico, but like a cheap, accessible, portable objects, literature, in competition again with the mobile devices. How do you feel that? Because like Nestor Garcia Canclini, the sociologist, he said that it's not a decreasing of reading. People are reading more and more and more, but the cell phone, you know, and writing also, again. But I don't know about this.
I think I mean, now that the industry is completely dead, long live historietas, because now younger artists have free will. No, not free will. Of course they have free will, but like free field to rebuild something. But now you don't have to be burdened by all this production costs and all the hassle that is distributing them, and then like blah blah blah. You sell them directly online. You go directly to Comixology, which is the Kindle of comics of Amazon. You go to all these different platforms. There's one, Bookmate, as well, that is pushing a lot of Latin American authors of comics to publish directly online in their application. So I think it's a new universe of possibility that will bring almost by default, it has to bring good artists, because the artists are out there. They just need to find the channel to distribute their work and find their readers.
I was thinking also in a completely different, let's say, approach to the same, but like maybe now some of the artists like that belonged formerly to this universe, now they are producing explicitly, not explicitly, but deliberately for, let's say, Instagram or for Twitter. Now it's mentioned like His or Trino in Mexico, who used to produce lots of comic strips for different newspapers that were published simultaneously in different 5 cities newspapers, the same comic strip, I mean, every day, and now, or a cartoon, and now they are not publishing anymore because the newspapers are disappearing, and now the only place they can display their work is in Instagram or Twitter or Facebook, I mean.
Yeah, I think the industry is completely
which is a different type of portability again, no?
Yeah. But I mean, I agree. It's the readers are there, and the demand for this kind of products is still there, but producers need to find the channels, and some of them will. The ones that will have the technical resources to get a phone and put it up there and be technical with these things will do, and those who are not technically savvy probably won't.
Yeah, disappear now.
Yeah.
Do you want to say anything else before we cut, Marisol? I know you brought all your the treasures, the jewels of the queen.
Maybe just to round up this notion about portability and technical capacity, I will say very quickly that when we get to this notion, to this size of portability, and actually trying to link it with your art as well, because from the other conversation with Patricia that you made, at some point you said that, and this is so evident, and what makes your art so rich is that you dwell on limitations and an economy of elements, and you work with limitations. So it's part of like the essential element of your work. It's like, this is what we have, as was the case in Ajusco, and because this is how you were brought up. You know, there's this limits, and what do you do from those limits? And I think, trying to link it with comics, I think limitations are productive. This is like an open question. There's a point to which limitations are productive, but there's a point in which limitations are, how do you say, que te ahorcan, like.
The limitations kill you.
Limitations can also kill you, and this is the case of comic books, partly because at the beginning you used to have this kind of format, this very generous, large formats in which artists could be very creative about how to fill the page. So here it's a very square, not very creative, but some others were really.
Lots of detail, no?
Yeah, lots of detail, but more of that, like the way they play with the grid, and some of them were completely off the grid, and this is the kind of things that we celebrate today, like how the comic artists just went completely off the grid and changed it, because they changed it because they have space to change it. So because many things happen that made us arrive to this format, which is, so it's like a quarter of this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so part of what happened is that the economy became worse, but people couldn't pay, so everything became more expensive to produce, but people couldn't spend more on the same product. So the producers, instead of raising the price, they diminished
the size
of it,
right,
until we get here. But when you get here, it gets I mean, there's not a lot of things you can do with this size of paper. It just becomes stiffened and just uncreative and boring, right? So at what point do limitations get
oh, that's a good question, yeah. I don't know. No, you're right. It's maybe like trying to read Little Nemo in Slumberland in this scale. Of course, it's impossible. You have something so beautiful and rich that you cannot just make it microscopic, no?
That's a perfect example. Yeah, and to think like Little Nemo was, when you see the originals, they're like this. Yeah. Of course, this guy needed so much space to do these things. Although at the end, of course, a lot of that detail is lost because it wasn't printed at that size. Yeah. But it doesn't matter. He had, like an artist, he had space and resources, particular resources to do these things.
I think in my case and in my work, just to finish myself, is that I went making this artwork that is to be dismantled and to rearrange again, to be transported in a little bag in your backpack, because I didn't have a car, I didn't have enough budget to rent a van to transport materials and tools, or a studio even. I just had myself, and then that's the way I started. So in a way, this project reminds me of the very beginning, like trying to use limits as material as well, not the materials, the objects, but all the restrictions. This is exactly that. I've been trying to use disciplinedly these kind of boundaries as not to suffocate me, but to make them something that produces joy and questions, and possibly more questions, knowledge, language, discourse. So that's maybe my goal, no? Not to be suffocated by
That's a great goal in life.
Thank you, Marisol.
Thank you.